mean, I just feel the story needs to be told, and it does need to be told, even to put the record straight.
This is the story of what David says happened to him a long time ago, back in 1975, when he was 20 years old. We're not using his real name, but it is him speaking. What are we going to call you?
Let's call me David. Is
David.
that okay? Yeah.
That's fine. David's story is about historical sex abuse, allegedly committed by high-profile people. It's shocking and disturbing to hear. We've heard similar accounts in the news, and it involves former Conservative politicians and influential men in the business, legal and military worlds, many of whom are now dead. Allegations of this nature aren't confined to one political party in particular. There have been claims against the Labour peer Greville Janner, which his family strongly denied, and against the former Liberal MP Cyril Smith, who's now dead. Back to David. He's now 60 years old, married with a family and working. Last year he read an article in a national newspaper about how boys were lured into child sex abuse in London. He says it prompted him to recall events from 40 years ago of alleged rape, sex parties, drugs, drink, appalling child abuse, and those who were involved.
This was something that I had buried for almost 40 years.
Had you not thought about it over all those years?
Well, more recently, I mean, there were sex scandals appearing in the Catholic Church. That sort of was stirring things in the back of my head. Then there were stories about celebrities involved in child abuse and so on. And then I started reading stuff about political involvement in this. And this article really blew the doors wide open, opened the vault, so to speak, and let the demons out. So later on that night, I actually gave the newspaper to my wife, and she read it and said, well, why are you showing me this? And at that stage, I just broke down uncontrollably and told her, I was involved in this.
And that's the first time your wife had heard about it?
That was the first time, yes. It was talk about throwing a hand grenade into a marriage. Told her everything that had happened, and she was obviously stunned and shocked.
David seemed credible to me, but with such serious allegations like this, you can't just take them at face value. Since that first meeting, we've been checking out his story as much as we can. We've spoken to former and current police officers, psychologists and politicians who were around at the time. We have a thick file of cuttings, a copy of a diary and photos. More on those later. We may never know the truth, and the consequences for victims like David and those who are accused wrongly can be devastating. After all, it happened 40 years ago, and he was in London for just 3 months. Can one newspaper article trigger all these memories? And how certain can we be of them? We aren't the only ones trying to find the evidence. David, too, has been doing his own research. You've been looking for evidence, haven't you, of that it actually happened and that you can show...
I've tried to sort of, see if I can gather evidence that I can actually prove that I was in the places that I said I was, where I worked, and so on. It's a 45 single, and you can see it's called Make Me Smile, Come Up and See Me, Steve Harley and Cockney Rebel. This entered the charts almost at the same week that I entered London, 1975. It seemed to be playing all the time. If I was going to a restaurant or having a sandwich, it seemed to be on the air all the time. And this whole thing just has a special resonance with me about Make Me Smile, because that's what everyone seemed to want me to do at the time.
Come up and see me, make me smile. I'll do what you want, running wild.
In 1975, we were just coming out of recession. Unemployment was high, inflation had rocketed, we had the European referendum, and Labour's Harold Wilson was Prime Minister. Over the next 4 days, we'll play the interview and also tell you what questions we've been asking and how we tried to stand it up. He arrived in London on the 24th of February 1975 to start work in a bookshop. And the reason he went to London, he says, was because he was desperate to escape the Troubles. After only a couple of days, he says he lost £20 to con artists, and feeling stupid and pretty hungry, he wandered around Piccadilly Circus hoping to win it back in the amusement arcades. He says that a man approached him, introduced himself as Keith, and offered to take him to a pub to meet another man who could lend him some money. It was in the pub that he met a man called Charles Hornby. After a drink, Charles and Keith took David out for supper. David says Keith wasn't a public or political figure, but Charles Hornby he describes as an exceptionally well-dressed man. We found newspaper cuttings from September 1975 about a court case in which Charles Hornby, a well-connected old Etonian, was convicted of several offences, including committing acts of gross indecency. David picks up the story after Charles Hornby had invited him back to his flat along with Keith. To warn you, some of this interview is upsetting and of an adult nature.
They said, look, why don't you come back? I live in Knightsbridge. Go there, have a few drinks, have one for the road. We will order a taxi. I'll give you the £20 loan and we'll sort it out there. So, of course, the alarm bells were ringing and I was feeling a bit worried. To be honest, there was a part of me also that said, this could be a great opportunity. I'm alone in London. I've met two people, one of whom seems to be quite influential, very well bred, very cultured, and maybe it would do no harm to sort of make friends. We went to a place called Ennismore Gardens, and again then we had more drinks and conversations about lots of other things. And I was really starting to feel, a little bit drowsy and knew myself that it was time to go. And I kept sort of reaching for my coat and trying to go out, but then they would generate conversation around something else. I had never been truly drunk, but I knew what it was like to be sort of a bit tipsy. This was a completely different experience. It was like a nausea, just a weird sensation. So I said to them, look, I need to go here. I need to leave. I'm not feeling well. I got up and I was walking down a hallway and Charles Hornby was behind me and I thought he was going to see me out of the door. But suddenly I was sort of dragged and turned into a bedroom. And before I knew it, the two of them were sort of attacking me, ripping, the trousers off me and so on. And I was flung over onto my belly. And Keith, he threw himself across my back. And I was raped. Charles Hornby raped me.
Do you actually remember it, or were you too...
I can remember, it was almost as if I was watching this happen to someone else. It was almost like a detached experience. You were aware of what was happening, but it was like it couldn't be happening to me. This is just not happening. And it was just appalling, that's all I can say. During one stage, when I was being raped, I remember Charles Hornby saying, is he okay? Is he still breathing? And Keith... I remember his head moved very close to my mouth and he said, I think the little bastard's enjoying it. And he bit me on the shoulder. Oh, and that was, excruciating. So I screamed. And at that stage, I just felt completely broken. After that, I just collapsed, emotionally. I didn't care what they did. I sort of said, they can do whatever they want now. I'm going to die. There's a motivation. There's a reason for this. They're killing me. So it can be now, it can be later. But it was just like a totally giving up. That was the end. And I remember feeling, it was ironic to have survived so many years in the Troubles, surviving shootings and bombings, only to be killed in London, totally randomly and anonymously. I came from a sort of a secluded Catholic upbringing. The idea that something like this would happen was just off the scale, was just something that was horrific and shocking. So in any event, I passed out and I just felt totally broken and devastated and humiliated.
What did you do at that point?
I was still groggy. I was in pain. I was aching from head to foot all over. So he then went out and made breakfast and was really all very matter of fact, as if nothing had happened. He said, I have some very important people who would just love to meet you. And I said, you've got the wrong end of the stick. I'm not like that. This has been a total misunderstanding. This is not going to happen. And then he said that when I had been unconscious, they had taken sort of compromising photographs with me and Keith. And he warned that these could be sent home to my family if I didn't do what I was told.
Oh, what did that make you
well, I
feel
just
at that
felt
point?
sick to the stomach. He was saying, how would your mother, a good Catholic woman, feel receiving a letter and opening these up to see what your son was doing in London? It would break her heart. I didn't know what to think. I was totally shocked. I just felt out of my depth.
Were you scared, do you think?
I felt fear, absolutely. I felt fear, terror even. Just a sense of being completely trapped and not knowing what's happening. How did I get into this? And the other thing I felt, of course, was guilt. Had I been sending out the wrong signals? Is it my fault that this happened? Did I give the impression that I was looking for something?
What happened after that?
I was sort of thinking, well, hopefully now this is the end of the matter. But the next day they appeared in the bookshop and they came up to me and said, there's a party this weekend. You'll be getting the opportunity to meet your elders and your betters. You know, you have great potential. You're going to earn a lot of money and so on. Then he made another threat. Unfortunately, 2 days after I had started work, there was a young policeman in London who had been shot dead by the IRA. And he said, a young Irishman comes to London. 2 days later, there's a policeman shot dead. He said, I could click my fingers and you could be questioned about this by lunchtime. And I said, but sure, I was in the shop that day. And he said, well, you know, I'm not saying you pulled the trigger, but you could have been over here helping and assisting and gathering intelligence, you know, nice quiet sleeper working in a bookshop. So he said, either you will be at this party at the weekend or you will be in a police cell getting a confession kicked out of you.
I'm going to introduce you now to former Detective Chief Inspector Dave Marshall. You'll be hearing from him over the next few days. He was with the Met for over 30 years and was head of the paedophile unit. Until recently, he was on the panel of the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry in Northern Ireland and has listened to many victims' stories. I played him parts of David's interview and asked him what he made of it.
Without talking about the specific case, but the scenario and the events that he talks about actually bear a remarkable semblance to an inquiry I was involved on in the 1980s in the West End of London, which focused on a group of paedophiles who were operating in Leicester Square in an area called the Meat Rack in Piccadilly Circus outside the Wimpy Bar, where young lads who'd perhaps run away from home or had come to London looking for a better life, they'd be befriended by this group of paedophiles and taken perhaps for a meal. They may be taken back to their house, allowed to stay there overnight, again given food to eat, and then over a period of time the kind of grooming process would go on, where they would be given pornographic images to look at, and then it would progress to abuse. They may be given alcohol to drink, and then they find themselves in this scenario, and then having been abused, and if it's photographed, they're then in this kind of catch-22 situation, is that if they go, what's going to happen to the images? And threats may have been made that if they go, and people think, oh, why don't people come out? But it's not as easy as that. And even if they do and they tell people, will they be believed? It's and what will their family think? It's all those kind of issues you have to think about.
And from your experience, you've interviewed and talked to so many victims of this kind of abuse. How do you judge whether they're telling the truth?
Well, the starting premise is always that they would be believed. Everything's taken at face value until proved otherwise. Then you have a systematic approach of actually looking at every bit of the evidence that unfolds and the information you're given to check it out and see where it leads. We call it a search for the truth. And you have to accept the reality is that you won't necessarily always get all the pieces, but you want as many as you can. With victims, it's very hard to think of a case where a victim has deliberately lied about having been abused. There may be cases where they've been mistaken and got things slightly wrong, or someone else has told them something and they've added what someone else has said to their account.
There are similarities between David's account and Dave Marshall's operation, but there are differences too. The boys he's talking about were groomed gradually. David, who's 20, was drawn in pretty quickly in one evening. And David became involved with high-profile abusers. The abusers involved in Dave's operation were not influential. There are those who say that these stories are made up or are half-truths, that the victims have some kind of false memory syndrome. We did find references to some of the people David told us about on the internet and in newspaper articles from the time. But while that bolsters his story, it may also raise a question. Could his account be a conflation of his own memories and details from his research? But David is adamant that isn't the case. Tomorrow we'll hear the next part of David's story, the allegations of parties with influential politicians where he was paid for sex and that younger boys were involved.